The voice of the wind gradually had grown stronger, shriller, like a long, doleful neighing. It was the north wind, and its voice made me shudder. The recollection of the frightful winter I had spent in Karelia, between the Leningrad suburbs and the shores of Lake Ladoga, called up the vision of the silent, white, endless Karelian forests, and I shuddered as if the wind that caused the panes of the large windows to rattle was the merciless, frozen wind of Karelia. "It is the north wind," said Prince Eugene. "Yes, it is the Karelian wind," I said. "I recognize its voice." And there flashed through my memory the horses of Lake Ladoga. That morning I went with Svartstrom to see the horses freed from their prison of ice. A greenish sun in the pale blue sky shone like an unripe apple. Since the thaw had set in, the icebound surface of Lake Ladoga had begun creaking. It wailed. At times it shrieked shrilly as if in pain. In the deep of night, and from the end of the Curzio, a dugout, we could hear it suddenly crying out, wailing for hours at a time until the dawn. It was already spring. The lake exhaled its fetid breath into our faces, that lean smell of rotten wood and wet sawdust that is typical of the thaw. The opposite shore of Lake Ladoga looked like a thin pencil stroke on blotting paper. Now the sky was a cloudless, faded blue. It seemed a sky of tissue paper. Yonder, toward Leningrad, a gray cloud of smoke hung over the besieged city. The sky was slightly dirty, slightly crumpled. A green vein cut across the horizon. It seemed at times as if it could be seen throbbing, as if it were full of hot blood. That morning we went to see the icebound horses being freed. The night before, Colonel Maracalio, sniffing the wind, had said, "The horses caught in the ice crust will have to be buried. Spring is beginning." We went down to the lake through a thick birchwood in which were scattered huge stones of red granite. Suddenly, in front of us lay the vast, dark expanse of Lake Ladoga. The Soviet shore showed vaguely on the horizon behind a silvery mist, veined with pale blue and pink. From time to time, the monotonous call of the cuckoo, the sacred bird of Karelia, reached us from the thick of the vast Reicula forest. Before leaving the Curzio of Finnish headquarters to descend toward the lake, I had searched for Lieutenant Svartstrom. I had knocked in vain at the door of his little room in the Curzio behind the stables. The forest around headquarters looked deserted, and there was everywhere that lean smell, that tepid smell in the cold air. I approached the Curzio of the horses. A girl in a Lada uniform was preparing a pail of cellulose horse fodder for the colonel's horse. "Good day," I said. "Good day." She was the daughter of Colonel Maracalio, a tall, fair girl, a Finn from the Oulu in East Bothnia. She had followed her father to the front as a Lata during the First Finnish War in the winter of 1939. She saw to the headquarters mess and under her father's eye served at the table, a few hundred yards from the Russian trenches. Her hands were livid from the cold as she chopped a large sheet of cellulose paste into a pail filled with warm water. The horse was tied to a tree and was twisting its neck toward the pail filled with the cellulose. The winter had been frightful. The terrible cold, hunger, hardships, and toil had shrunk the faces of the Finnish people. The hard, bony features of the Kalevala heroes, as painted by Gall and Kalela, were again showing in the pale, fleshless faces. Soldiers, children, women, old people, and animals were all hungry. There was not a shred of hay or of straw, not an oat to feed the horses. Dogs had been slaughtered wholesale. The soldiers' gloves were made of dogs' skins. The people fed on cellulose bread, and horses relished the sweetish taste of that cellulose mash, the taste of cooked paper. The girl untied the horse, grasped the halter, and carrying the pail in her left hand, moved toward a wooden tub sitting on a bench. She poured the cellulose mash into the tub, and the horse began to eat slowly, gazing round from time to time. It looked toward the lake that shone dully through the trees. A cloud of steam rose from the tub. The horse sank his muzzle into that cloud, and then raised its head, looked toward the lake, and neighed. "What's the trouble?" I asked the girl. "He seems to be restless." Colonel Maracalio's daughter turned her face to the lake. "It smells the horses," she said. I smelt the horses too. It was a warm, greasy odor, mellowed by the resinous scent of the pines and by the lean odor of birches. The cuckoo gave its call at the edge of the forest. A squirrel, his tail erect, scampered up a tree trunk. The girl picked up the pail and went into the horse courser. I could hear her talking to the horses with that slow, sweet intonation of the Finnish language. I could hear the dull thud of the horses' hooves on the litter of birch branches, the twinkle of the iron rings, the short, impatient neighing. I made off toward the lake. Svartström was waiting for me at a turn in the path. He was leaning against a tree trunk, his high sheepskin cap tilted back toward the nape of his neck, his legs sunk halfway to his thighs in lap reindeer leather boots and upturned points like Persian slippers. His eyes were lowered, and he was slightly stooped as he tapped the bowl of his empty pipe on the palm of his hand. When I reached him, he raised his face, looked at me smiling, and said, "Good day." "Good day, Svartström." He was pale, his brow damp with the sweat of fatigue and lack of sleep. As if apologizing, he told me that he had been in the forest the entire night with a ranger patrol. "Where is Colonel Maracalio?" I inquired. "He has gone to the lines," he replied. He glanced at me as he tapped the empty pipe in the hollow of his hand, and from time to time he turned toward the lake. I saw his nostrils quivering. He breathed through his nose as woodsmen do, as Sisset, the Finnish rangers, do. A thin, cautious, suspicious breathing, just a thread of air. "You really want to go and see them?" asked Svartström. "It would have been better for you to follow the colonel to the lines. He purposely went to the trenches not to see them." The wind was charged with the odor of the horses, that greasy, sweet odor. "I should like to see them for the last time, Svartström, before they take them away." We walked on toward the lake. The snow was sodden. It was already spring snow, no longer white, but ivory-colored, with those green and yellow spots found in old ivory. Here and there, where it filmed the red granite rock, it was the color of wine. And where the trees were thinner, it seemed to be covered with a thin coating of ice, like a glistening piece of auriferous crystal, through which pine needles, colored pebbles, blades of grass, scales of that white skin that clothes birch trunks could be seen. Twisted tree roots broke through the crystal sheet, like frozen serpents. It seemed as if the trees drew sustenance from the ice, that the young leaves of a more tender green took their sap from that dead, glassy matter. Strange sounds ran through the air. It was not the wail of beaten iron, nor the sonorous shudder that bells make in the wind, nor the drawn-out soft note of a stroking finger on glass. It was not even the high, round hum of wild bees swarming in the thick of the woods, but it really was a wail. It seemed the moan of a wounded beast, the call of a lonely, despairing agony that crossed the sky like an invisible flock of doleful birds. Winter, that terrible winter of 1942, that had been the great scourge, the great plague of the Finnish people, the white plague that had filled the hospitals and churchyards of the whole of Finland, lay now like a huge naked corpse across the lakes and the woods. That huge decomposing body tainted the air with its lean smell of rotten wood. And the first spring breeze was already bringing its tired scents, its tepid odors, its intermittent bestial dog's breath. The very snow seemed to be lukewarm. For some days the soldiers had been less sad, more lively. Their voices were a little louder, and during certain hours of the day, a peculiar restlessness was creeping through the lines in the corsus, among latalas, through the trenches and the dugouts scooped into the thick of the wild Raikola forest. To celebrate the return of spring, which is their sacred season of the year, the men of the north light great fires on the mountains, sing, drink, and dance all night. But spring is the insidious disease of the north. It rots and dissolves all the life that winter has jealously guarded and protected within its prison of ice, and brings its fatal gifts: love, the joy of living, the yielding to light thoughts and gay feelings, the enjoyment of strife, of idleness, and of sleep, the fever of the senses, the deluding weddings with nature. It is the season in which the eye of the man of the north is lighted with a turbid flame, and the proud shadow of death that winter sweeps clean and free, sets on his brow. We have taken the wrong way, Svartström. I no longer recognize the path I had so often followed during the winter on my way to the lake to see the horses. It had become narrower, more winding. The forest had grown thicker. As the snow thaws and changes color, and the spring chrysalis bursts into flight out of the shining, icy cocoon, leaving the bare dead slough of winter, the forest regains mastery over the snow and the frost, and becomes thick again, entangled, secretive. A green, mysterious, and forbidden universe. Svartström stepped slowly and cautiously. He stopped now and again to listen, detecting in the rhythmical silence of the forest, in that musical silence of nature, the crackling of the branches, the patter of the squirrel in a pine tree, the darting rustle of the hare, the anxious sniffling of the fox, the call of a bird, the whisper of a leaf, and far away, diseased and defiled, the voice of man. The silence around us was no longer the dead silence of winter, frosty and transparent as a block of crystal. It was a living silence, shot through by warm streams of colors, sounds, and odors. The silence was like a river that I felt flowing around us. I thought I was being carried down the current of that invisible river, between the banks that were like warm, moist lips. The mellow heat of the rising sun was pervading the forest. As the sun gradually climbed up along the arch of the horizon, raising a slight pink mist from the silvery surface of the lake, there came with the wind a far-off rattling of machine guns, solitary rifle shots, the rapt song of the cuckoo. And at the end of that landscape of sounds, colors, and odors, within a break of the forest, there flashed something opaque, something shiny, like the shimmering of an unreal sea. Lake Ladoga, the vast frozen expanse of Lake Ladoga. At last, we stepped out of the forest onto the shore of the lake and saw the horses. It happened last year in October. The Finnish vanguard, after crossing the Vuoksi wilderness, crossed the threshold of the wild, limitless Raikkula forest. It was full of Russian troops. Almost the entire Soviet artillery of the northern sector of the Karelian Isthmus had rushed towards Lake Ladoga to escape the stranglehold of the Finnish army. It had hoped to ship the guns and the horses and to bring them to safety across the lake. But the Soviet lighters and tugs were late in arriving. Every hour of delay could prove fatal, for the frost had set in, gripping and savage. The lake was likely to freeze at any moment, and the Finnish troops, formed of ranger detachments, were gliding through the thick forest and pressing the Russians on all sides. On the third day, a huge fire flared in the Raikkula forest. Men, horses, and trees, clutched within the circle of fire, sent out awful cries. The rangers, firing through that wall of smoke and flames, blocked every avenue of escape. Mad with terror, the horses of the Soviet artillery, there were almost 1,000 of them, hurled themselves into the furnace and broke through the besieging flames and machine guns. Many perished within the flames, but most of them succeeded in reaching the shores of the lake and threw themselves into the water. The lake is not deep there, not more than 6 feet, but 100 yards from the shore the bottom suddenly drops. Pressed within that narrow space between the deeper water and the barrier of the fire, the horses clustered, shuddering with cold and fear, their heads stretched out above the surface of the water. Those nearer to land were scorched by the flames and reared and struggled to hoist themselves onto the backs of others, tried to push a way open by biting and kicking. All the while still madly struggling, the ice gripped them. The north wind swooped down during the night. The north wind blows from the Murmansk Sea like an angel of doom, crying aloud, and the land suddenly dies. The cold became frightful. Suddenly, with the peculiar vibrating noise of breaking glass, the water froze. The heat balance was broken, and the sea, the lakes, the rivers froze. In such instances, even sea waves are gripped in midair and become rounded ice waves suspended in the void. On the following day, when the first ranger patrols, their hair singed, their faces blackened by smoke, cautiously stepped over the warm ashes in the charred forest and reached the lake shore, a horrible and amazing sight met their eyes. The lake looked like a vast sheet of white marble on which rested hundreds upon hundreds of horses' heads. They appeared to have been chopped off cleanly with an axe. Only the heads stuck out of the crust of ice. And they were all facing the shore. The white flame of terror still burnt in their wide-open eyes. Close to the shore, a tangle of wildly rearing horses rose from the prison of ice. Later, winter came. The hissing north wind swept the snow away. The surface of the lake was as clean and smooth as an ice hockey rink. During the dull days of the endless winter, toward noon, when a little faded light rains from the sky, Colonel Maracalio's soldiers used to go down to the lake and sit on the heads of the horses. They were like wooden horses on a merry-go-round. Tournez, tournez, bon cheval de bois. Turn, turn, good wooden horses. The scene might have been painted by Bosch. The wind through which the black skeletons of the trees played a sweet, childish, sad music. The sheet of ice seemed to turn, as the horses of that macabre merry-go-round tossing their manes would curve to the sad tune of the sweet, childish music. The soldiers would shout, "Hop là! Tournez, tournez, bon cheval de bois!" On Sunday mornings, the rangers gathered in the Raicola, La Tala, and after drinking a cup of tea, walked toward the lake. They used to go down to the lake and sit on the heads of the horses. The accordion player would start a laulu, the Veritosa, which is the song of the lookout. Wrapped in their sheepskin coats, the rangers would sing together the sad laulu. Then the player, sitting on the frozen mane, would run his fingers over the keyboard, and the rangers would take up the Rapuran laulu, the song of the cuckoo, which is the sacred bird of Karelia. The cuckoo's call rang sad and loud in the silence of the forest. Guns rumbled on the opposite shore of Lake Ladoga. The crash of the explosion spread from tree to tree like a flutter of wings, a rustle of leaves. And above the living silence that was rendered deeper and more secret by the occasional ping of isolated rifle shots rose persistent, monotonous, and very pure the call of the cuckoo, a call which seemed to become human. Sometimes Svartstrom and I also went down to the lake and sat on the heads of the horses. Leaning his elbow on the hard, icy mane, Svartstrom tapped the empty pipe in the hollow of his hand and gazed fixedly in front of him across the frozen, silvery expanse of the lake. Svartstrom hails from Viipuri, called Viborg by the Swedes, the Karelian city on the shore of the Gulf of Finland facing Leningrad. His wife is a young Leningrad Russian of French origin, and he has something delicate and gentle in him that men in the north seldom possess. Perhaps something French that he has acquired from his wife, his baby kulta. Kulta meaning golden in Finnish. He knows a few French words. He can say oui, charmant, pauvre petit. He can say amour. He often says amour. And he also says très beaucoup. Svartstrom by profession is a poster designer, and he spends many hours in drawing red and blue flowers with a red and blue pencil, in cutting baby Kulta's name into the white bark of birches, and in writing the word amour in the snow with the tip of his stick. Svartstrom never had any tobacco. For a month he had been tapping the bowl of his empty pipe in the hollow of his hand, and I used to say to him, "Tell me the truth, Svartstrom. I'm sure you would even smoke a piece of human flesh." He used to grow pale and then reply, "If this war goes on," and I said, "If this war goes on, we shall become like beasts. And you too, don't you think?" And he answered, "I too, not to you, Ramon." I was fond of him. I became fond of Svartstrom on the day I saw him grow pale because of that piece of human flesh that the rangers had discovered in the haversack of a Russian paratrooper who had hidden in the forest for 2 months in a hole next to the corpse of a companion. In the Curzio that night, Svartström had vomited. He wept, saying, "They have shot him, but is it his fault? We shall all become like wild beasts, and we shall all end by eating each other." He was not drunk. He very seldom drank. It was not drink. It was that piece of human flesh that made him vomit. I became fond of him that day, but from time to time, when I saw him tapping his empty pipe in the hollow of his hand, I used to say to him, "Isn't it a fact, Svartström, that you would be capable of stuffing your pipe with a piece of human flesh?" Svartström smiled. His was a tired, sad smile. He looked at the heads of the horses protruding from the sheet of ice, those dead heads with hard frozen manes, those shiny, wide-open eyes filled with terror. He stroked with a light hand those extended muzzles, the bloodless nostrils, the lips twisted with a despairing neighing, a neighing that was buried within the mouth full of frozen foam. Then, as we walked off in silence, we were wont to caress in passing, the manes white with sleet. The wind was softly hissing over the vast sheet of ice. That morning we went to see the horses being freed from their prison of ice. A sweet and greasy odor floated in the mild air. It was near the end of April, and the sun was already warm. For some days since the thaw had set in, the heads of the horses gripped within the crust of the ice had begun to stink. During certain hours of the day, that odor of carrion was beyond endurance, and Colonel Mericalio had given the order to take the horses out of the water and bury them in the thick of the forest. Squads of soldiers, equipped with saws, axes, crowbars, mattocks, and ropes, had gone down to Lake Ladoga with 100 sledges. When we reached the shore, the soldiers were already at work. Some 50 carcasses were heaped crossways on the sledges. They were no longer stiff, but limp, swollen. Their long manes, freed by the thaw, were floating. The eyelids hung on their watery, swelling eyes. The soldiers broke the ice crust with mattocks and axes, and the horses floated upturned on the dirty, whitish water filled with air bubbles and spongy snow. The soldiers roped the carcasses and dragged them to the shore. The heads dangled over the sides of the sledges. The artillery horses scattered through the forest and neighed, smelling that sweet and heavy odor, and the horses hitched to the shafts of the sledges answered with long, lamenting neighs. "Poi, poi, giddy up!" shouted the soldiers, brandishing their whips. The sledges guided away on the muddy snow with a dull rustle, and the harness bells made a gay sound in the tepid air, almost a merry lament. The room by now was steeped in shadow. The voice of the wind among the old trees of Oak Hill was loud and sad, and I shuddered listening to the doleful neighing of the north wind. "You are cruel," said Prince Eugene. "I feel sorry for you." "I am deeply grateful to you," I said and laughed, but I at once felt ashamed of my laughter, and I blushed. "I feel sorry for myself, too. I am ashamed of my feeling of self-pity." "Oh, you are cruel," said Prince Eugene. "I wish I could help you." "Let me tell you a strange dream," I said. "It is a dream which often troubles my nights. I walk into a square crowded with people who are all looking upward, and I raise my eyes and see a high mountain sheer above the square. A large cross is on the mountain top. A crucified horse hangs from the crossbeam. The executioners, standing on ladders, are hammering the last nails in. The hammers can be heard striking the nails. The crucified horse dangles its head from side to side and neighs softly. The silent crowd weeps. The sacrifice of the horse Christ, the tragedy of that animal Golgotha. I wish you would help me to understand the meaning of this dream. Might not the death of the horse signify the death of all that is noble and pure in man? Don't you think that this dream refers to the war?" "The very war itself is but a dream," said Prince Eugene, passing his hand across his brow and his eyes. "All that is noble, gentle, and pure in Europe is dying. The horse is our homeland. You understand what I mean by this. Our homeland, our ancient homeland, is dying. And all those obsessing pictures, that persistent obsession of neighing, of the horrible and sad odor of the dead horses lying on their backs along the roads of the war, don't they seem to correspond to the vision of war? to our voice, our odor, to the odor of dead Europe? Don't you also think that this dream means something similar? It is perhaps better not to interpret dreams. Enough, said Prince Eugene. Then he leaned toward me and said in a low voice, "Ah, if I could but suffer as you do."